It was during my daily routine of shaping a clay bowl that I first noticed her. My hands were working with the familiar motions, but my eyes kept wandering to a figure curled by the fireplace. This new presence in my home, a slender, soot-gray cat, watched me with large amber eyes that seemed to understand more than I could express. In that quiet moment, I decided to name her Nina. Earlier that day, everything began when I heard a gentle tapping at my door. I hesitated for a moment, standing barefoot on the chilly stone floor, perplexed. When I finally opened the old wooden door, there she was, calm and composed, a stark contrast to the usual skittish strays that roamed our hilltop village. It felt as if she were searching for something, perhaps a place where she belonged. As I crouched down to greet her with a soft, "Ciao, Bella," her ears perked up. She blinked slowly, then lifted a paw to tap the threshold again, like she was making her intentions clear. I opened the door wider, inviting her in. She moved with a delicate grace, her paws silent against the terracotta tiles. Watching her curl into a tight ball on the corner rug, I realized she was claiming a space in my life that I hadn't even recognized as empty. In the silence that followed, I connected with Nina, observing how she settled in. She seemed to have her own rhythm, eating sparingly and napping peacefully by the fire, all the while providing me with a sense of companionship that was unexpectedly fulfilling. Later, when Marco stopped by with leftover bread and raised an eyebrow at the sight of her, I simply shrugged and said, "She knocked." What was I supposed to do? It was a rather simple reaction, yet it spoke volumes about how Nina's presence was beginning to shift my perspective on solitude. As the days passed, I found a subtle transformation taking place within me. Nina didn't intrude on my space. Instead, she moved with a quiet dignity that made her feel like an old friend. It was a gentle unfolding of a new chapter, teaching me more about connection and warmth than I had anticipated. On a chilly evening, I noticed something unsettling about Nina. Curled up in a corner of the studio, she emitted a low, wavering cry that broke the stillness of the house. Her body trembled, as if she was wrestling with something more than just the evening's chill. It sent a wave of fear through me, a sense that this was not simply exhaustion or discomfort. Earlier that day, I had been lost in the rhythm of shaping clay, content with my thoughts when the atmosphere shifted. The cool breeze rustled the olive branches outside, a gentle reminder of the world beyond my little studio. I couldn't shake the worry about Nina. Something felt off. As I watched her struggle, I instinctively called Julia. She arrived within minutes, barely taking a moment to catch her breath. Barefoot and wrapped in a blanket, her expression conveyed experience and concern. Julia approached Nina with a calmness that I found reassuring. The air felt thick with tension as she assessed the situation, each creak of the old stone walls amplifying the silence around us. "What's wrong with her?" I asked, heart racing. Julia's steady voice responded, explaining how Nina's symptoms could indicate something deeper, possibly neurological or a remnant of past trauma. The hidden damage, she called it, discomfort that often reveals itself only when it's too late. The first time I had seen Nina, there was a distinct spark in her eyes, hinting at something beyond the simple needs of an animal. I had discovered her on the third night, perched by the window and gazing into the darkness with alert ears. It was clear she held more within her than just hunger. That was when I met Milo. I spotted him lingering under an olive tree, a sturdy cat with scruffy fur and a torn ear and a look that spoke of indecision. He glared at the house, clearly uncertain about approaching. When I opened the door, he chose to stay put, a stark contrast to Nina, who stepped out with unyielding curiosity. She approached him without hesitation, the two of them exchanging silent looks, a moment of recognition untainted by hisses or aggression. The following morning, Julia arrived with a soft crate in hand, concern evident in her eyes. "You can't keep them both," she said with a gentle firmness. "Remember the routine. You feed them and then find them homes." But my feelings toward them began to deepen. They weren't just any cats to me. Marco pointed out the obvious. "You're getting too involved. They're animals, not house guests." And yet, as the days passed, my resolve to stick to the plan began to crumble. While Nina had seamlessly settled into the studio, Milo maintained his distance, watching from the sidelines. As I wrestled with my own rules about keeping them, I found myself reflecting on their presence in my life. Each day felt like a new chapter in an uncertain story, one that I was reluctant to finish. It was in those quiet moments that I felt the weight of fear creeping in. Just 3 days after Nina's sudden collapse, a fragile calm seemed to be slipping away. Word spread fast in our small town, where every detail is absorbed like clay shaping to molds. I found myself at the well when Signora Letty, an older neighbor, casually mentioned a bizarre illness affecting stray animals near the orchards. Her tone suggested nonchalance, but a sense of urgency nagged at me. That evening, a call from Luca, the local vet, added to my worries. His voice was measured, as if he were treading carefully around something unsettling. He spoke of neurological issues and progressive symptoms, likely viral. He wanted to see Nina personally. As the sun began to rise the next day, I couldn't help but feel apprehensive. Meanwhile, in the space of my home, I was confronted with my own feelings of inadequacy. Nina hadn't just sought shelter. I realized she might have been looking for something I wasn't equipped to provide. My hands, still coated in clay, served as a reminder of the tangible efforts I'd poured into my craft, but how did that relate to the emotional turmoil surrounding us? On that day, Milo, usually the wild and vibrant spirit of the house, stood by the studio door. He was unusually still, his eyes glinting from the shadows, suggesting a deep awareness that I did not yet understand. It felt as though he was keeping watch over us, not from fear, but from a recognition of something larger than himself. In contrast, Marco's perspective landed heavier. He arrived the next morning with his usual loaf of bread and a familiar frown. "This isn't your responsibility," he advised gently yet firmly, as he often did when he felt my emotions clouding my judgment. It was a fair point, but all I could picture was Nina's small form curled up beside my drying pots, seeking reassurance from the earth itself. A jumble of emotions churned within me, gratitude for Nina's trust mixed with the anxiety of feeling ill-prepared to help her. As I waited for Luca's arrival, the house felt delicate, as if Nina's presence had drawn the light from every corner. Julia had stayed back after her initial examination, speaking in hushed tones while she mixed her herbs and liquids, moving with the grace of someone who regularly bore others' pain without letting it settle too deeply in her own soul. It wasn't just a medical concern. It was about holding space for another's suffering, and in moments of quiet, I had to ask myself, is it possible to truly be there for someone when your own strength feels so limited? The storm rolled in suddenly that evening, the thunder rumbling low over rooftops. The sky turned deep purple and gloomy gray, filling the air with the scent of rain. As wind whipped through the house and the shutters banged like old bones, a feeling of unease settled over me. It hit me then. Nina was no longer by the hearth. I called her name, my voice barely cutting through the rising sound of rain, panic gripping my heart as I searched every empty corner. Finally, I found her, crouched by the door. Her ears were pinned back, her body tense, and she wasn't looking at me. Instead, her gaze was fixed on something beyond the glass. And that's when I saw him, Milo. Earlier, I had walked for hours along the gravel path by the orchard, softly calling out even though I knew I wouldn't get a response. It felt futile, much like trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. The heaviness of the situation was compounded by Nina's reluctance to eat. Julia had suggested taking Nina to the clinic, but I could see the worry etched across her face. I understood what that could mean: quarantine, separation, or an ending I wasn't ready to confront. What had begun as an act of kindness was becoming something much more serious, with consequences none of us anticipated. That night, as I stood at the doorway of the studio, arms crossed, I felt the silence close in on me, like the damp wind curling in from the hills. Nina lay wrapped in a worn blanket, her breaths deep but shallow. Watching her chest rise and fall felt like bearing witness to unspeakable truths. There was a complex feeling building inside me, not just pity or care, but something deeper. It was hard to pinpoint. Had I saved her, or had she somehow saved me in return? Julia pushed for a decision soon. Should we keep her for good, isolate her, or prepare for the difficult prospect of losing her? The thought of returning her to a cage felt intrinsically wrong, particularly after she had claimed this space, and me so quietly and resolutely. It stirred a deep sense of betrayal within me. Was I really prepared to give up parts of my life for an animal I hardly knew, merely because she'd arrived at my doorstep when I needed companionship? Or was it fear? Fear of what her absence would rob from me. All these thoughts swirled in my mind as I watched Nina, caught between loyalty and an impending storm that mirrored the turmoil within. The air in the house grew thick with an unspoken tension. Milo, usually so confident, now wandered through the rooms like a ghost in a place that felt unfamiliar. He flinched at loud noises and sought refuge in dark corners for hours. Though his injury was minor, it hinted at something deeper, something troubling. I noticed he'd twitch in his sleep and hiss unexpectedly if touched, his eyes fixed on nothing, pupils dilated like dark valleys. Marco's visits became more frequent, but they were often shorter, filled with concern. One evening, as he paced the kitchen, his coat still on, he looked at me and said, "You're letting this go too far." His frustration was palpable. Meanwhile, Julia came by each afternoon to check on Milo. Her tone was cautious, and the silences stretched between us, heavy with uncertainty. There was no clear diagnosis for Milo's strange behavior, much like the storm clouds that had lingered since that night. That night, I remembered returning home to find Milo soaked to the skin, sitting on the stone ledge, something in his demeanor altered. His eyes were wide, wild, and unfocused, and as I got closer, I saw the shaking in his body and the quickness of his breathing. His nose bore little scratches, and fur caked with something darker than mud. It was clear that something had frightened him beyond the storm. I carefully wrapped him in a blanket. Although he felt limp, I could see the fear in his eyes as they darted around the room. Nina, unaffected by the chaos, watched him intently, as if sensing something I couldn't. I had brought both of them into my home. Did I also invite danger? Nina, in contrast, transformed into a vigilant guardian for Milo. She always stayed nearby, never too close, but always watchful, connected to his unease. At night, I would find her by his corner, eyes wide open, almost as if she could sense his struggles before they happened. It felt as though they had formed a bond during their time apart, something instinctual that I couldn't share in. For the first time, I felt like a stranger in my own home, grappling with the shifting dynamics between my pets. Inside the house, an unspoken heaviness hung in the air, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. Julia had started suggesting subtle changes to our routine, often prefacing her ideas with phrases like, "You might want to think about." In contrast, Marco had grown quiet, his visits becoming less frequent and shorter, as if he was evaluating a situation that left him speechless. His eyes seemed to ask a question I couldn't answer. "What are you really doing here, Leo?" Then, Luca arrived. He carried a small black case and spoke quietly, a weariness etched on his face. Sitting down at the kitchen table, he opened a folder filled with notes. He explained that while Milo's behavior wasn't a clear diagnosis, it pointed to a troubling sign, something potentially viral spreading in our area. His suggestion was clear: quarantine was necessary, but it seemed there was also a need to consider prevention. As the meaning sunk in, my stomach twisted with apprehension. When he asked if I was prepared to take that step, silence enveloped me. I found my gaze drifting towards Nina, curled up by the fireplace, her body relaxed, yet her eyes alert. Then there was Milo, huddled near the cellar steps, a mix of wildness and fatigue evident in his demeanor. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on me. They were here because I had chosen to let them in, but that decision now laid heavy on my conscience. I faced a heart-wrenching choice: saving them or protecting everything else by pushing them away. In that moment, I couldn't differentiate between the two. Days turned into an aimless blur, each one blending into the next in a suspended state of waiting. The house felt like it was holding its breath. I set aside my work. The kiln stood cold, clay on the wheel dried out. Instead, I often found myself lost in thought, gazing at the walls, noticing every flicker of movement. Nina would sleep between me and the door, her presence a silent question I felt ill-equipped to answer. Deep down, I knew what they were carrying: the loneliness, the silence, the undeniable need. I grappled with the feelings that had haunted me for so long, unsure if I was ready to let go. Sleep was elusive that night. Instead of focusing on the stars over the hills, I turned my attention to the dark corners of my home. The fire had burned out, and I found myself wrapped in a blanket, sitting in the armchair by the window, oddly restless. Nina, usually curled up, lay alert at my feet, fixated on the cellar door. I could hear Milo moving behind the thick wood, soft scuffs and a low growl that seemed to resonate through the floorboards. It had been 2 days since he'd eaten. His body was weakening, and somewhere inside him, his mind felt lost. As I sat there, I couldn't help but reflect on the choices I faced. This situation was about much more than just keeping 2 cats. It was about the life I had built to keep others at arm's length, clashing against the quiet reality that had taken shape within that space. Holding on felt essential, despite the absence of safety or peace that once came with it. Julia's gentle encouragement had started to penetrate my defenses. She brought me pamphlets from rehoming centers and mobile care units, as well as a lead on someone in Florence who could help with aggressive strays. Her approach was soft, yet the firmness in her voice remained clear. "If you keep them both," she cautioned, "you might lose more than you realize." I didn't share my own feelings of loss, which had already begun to creep in. Then there was Marco. Uninvited, he stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, as if bracing himself against the weight of my emotions. "You're risking everything for a feeling," he said firmly. "They aren't your children. This isn't your fight." What neither of them understood was that reason had slipped away weeks before. This wasn't merely a question of safety or comfort for my home. It was about the deeper meaning of choice, about the need to hold on even when hope seemed distant and the outcome uncertain. The next morning, I found myself picking up the phone. I called Luca, asking him to come over. While my voice remained steady, a sense of unraveling stirred within me, each piece of my resolve straining under the pressure of what was next. Shortly after, Julia arrived without needing an invitation, carrying a carrier and a small black box that felt heavy to face. The morning was unusually quiet, as though the world was bracing for something significant. Birds were absent, and the olive trees outside stood still, hinting at an impending change. I woke before dawn, unable to find comfort in sleep. The calm reminded me of that solemn moment before a funeral, where even the air feels heavy with unspoken emotions. As I quietly observed Nina nestled by the hearth and Milo resting in the shadows of the cellar, it struck me how still they both were. It seemed they understood the weight of the moment we were facing. I had brought them into this house, and now I found myself grappling with the decision of who would leave with me, uncertain if I had the strength for either choice. Eventually, the door creaked open, and Luca stepped inside. Without saying a word, I welcomed him in. His demeanor was serious, yet gentle, hands tucked deep in his coat pockets as if he were trying to steady himself. Shortly after, Julia entered, her calm presence quietly sharing the burden I felt. Marco followed, lingering at the entrance, looking indecisive about entering this somber space. With a sense of gravity, I moved deliberately, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what the moment demanded. I picked up the thin fleece blanket from the studio chair, one that had once brought comfort to Milo during brighter days, and wrapped it around him. He offered no resistance as I enfolded him, the warmth of his body contrasting sharply with the weight of our shared grief. In that close space, I felt a release, a quiet letting go that echoed in the silence. Milo emerged from the cellar, head bowed and eyes lacking their usual spark. When I reached out, he leaned against my palm. It wasn't affection, but a profound understanding, as if he recognized the crossroads we faced. Nearby, Nina sat still, her eyes fixed on him. In that moment, something sacred seemed to pass between them, perhaps grief or forgiveness. As I held Milo close, those needed words stumbled out. "You were never a burden." I was unsure whether I spoke for him, for myself, or perhaps for both of us, but it felt necessary. Each movement, each shared glance, reinforced the gravity of our situation and the impact we held on one another in this fragile moment. The quiet has settled in after Luca pulled away with Milo, leaving a space that feels significant, yet respectful. I can still picture Nina by the door, her silhouette framed by the soft winter light. She didn't cry or reach for me. Instead, she stood beside the carrier, watching Milo with a mix of sadness and understanding that resonated deeply within me. Before securing the latch on the carrier, I had placed Milo inside, adjusting the blanket around him one last time. My hands felt weary, and the weight of the moment was heavy. It was a simple task, yet it carried so much meaning. Now the house feels different. Milo's corner remains untouched, the blanket folded neatly, almost as if he might return. I haven't been able to disturb it. It's not just a memory for me, it's a memory we both share. Nina often looks at that spot, not with longing, but with a stillness that acknowledges our connection to Milo. Nina has chosen to stay close these days, curling up beside me at night or soaking in the morning sun that streams through the studio window. Her demeanor has relaxed. She's no longer so watchful, but carries the echoes of our experiences together. Life has found its rhythm again, with the familiar sounds of clay on the wheel and the gentle scratch of a brush against glaze. Yet I've noticed a change within myself, a new softness that makes me more open to emotions I had kept at bay in the past. Julia visits frequently, bringing warmth with her, while Marco, a bit more at ease now, lingers longer for coffee and asks about Nina. His questions suggest a care that, though unspoken, is very much felt. What lies ahead is uncertain. I wonder about how long Nina will be with me, and if another stray might find their way here. But one thing is clear, if another paw comes to my door, I will be ready to welcome them. Have you ever experienced the ability of love to change lives, particularly in moments filled with uncertainty? It's remarkable how welcoming something unexpected can bring about profound shifts, not only for them, but also for ourselves. Take the story of Nina, for example. Her arrival was subtle yet impactful, reminding us that sometimes these significant decisions come quietly. If you find this theme relatable, perhaps you've opened your heart or home in a similar way, why not share your story? Your experiences matter, and by discussing them in the comments, we can foster a community built on shared moments of kindness. For those intrigued by tales of unexpected connections and the journey of finding new beginnings, consider keeping in touch with more stories like this. By subscribing and activating notifications, you can discover what comes next. Just think about the possibilities that could be waiting just outside your door.